Somewhere beneath the frozen ground of Siberia, something has been sleeping for tens of thousands of years. Every summer, as the ice slowly retreats, the permafrost gives up a little more of what it has been hiding. Perfectly preserved mammoths with skin, fur, and blood still inside them. Ancient viruses that have not seen sunlight since before the first pyramids were built. Entire craters that appear overnight with no warning, blasted open from underneath. And according to nomads who have crossed the desert south of here for centuries, something else entirely. A creature that does not even need to touch you to kill you. Scientists call it folklore. The people who live closest to it call it real. To understand why the frozen ground of Siberia has become one of the most unsettling places on Earth, we first need to understand exactly what permafrost is and just how much of the planet it controls. Permafrost is soil, rock, and sediment that has remained below the freezing point of water for at least 2 consecutive years. Though in Siberia, much of it has stayed frozen continuously for over 100,000 years without ever fully thawing. It covers close to 9 million square miles of the northern hemisphere, stretching across Russia, Canada, Alaska, and parts of Scandinavia. In Siberia alone, permafrost reaches depths of over 4,000 feet in some regions, meaning the deepest layers of ground have not seen warmth since long before modern humans existed anywhere on the planet. The coldest inhabited place on Earth sits inside this frozen region. The town of Oymyakon in the Sakha Republic regularly records winter temperatures below -80 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that exposed metal can shatter like glass, and breath freezes into visible crystals in the air. Rivers and even parts of the sea freeze solid enough to drive heavy trucks across them for months at a time. And underneath all of it, the permafrost acts like a natural freezer, roughly the size of a continent, holding on to everything that has ever fallen into it and rarely giving any of it back. This is exactly what makes Siberia so valuable to scientists and so strange to everyone else. In 2018, researchers working in the Yakutia region uncovered the frozen body of a foal that lived approximately 42,000 years ago during the last ice age. Its skin, hooves, and hair were still fully intact, and remarkably, liquid blood was extracted directly from its heart, a discovery once considered biologically impossible for an animal that old. Just a few years earlier, in the same general region, hunters stumbled upon the nearly complete body of a woolly mammoth nicknamed Yucca, with muscle tissue so well preserved that scientists were able to study the animal's brain structure in detail for the first time. Perhaps the most astonishing single discovery came in 2015, when 2 cave lion cubs, estimated to be over 10,000 years old, were pulled from the permafrost in such extraordinary condition that their whiskers were still attached to their faces, and their fur retained its original color. Researchers named them Uyan and Dina. Their teeth, fur, and internal organs had survived a stretch of time longer than the entire span of recorded human civilization. More recent finds have only deepened the mystery. In 2018, scientists recovered the frozen remains of a puppy, nicknamed Dogor, that lived approximately 18,000 years ago, so well preserved that researchers initially could not determine whether it was an early dog or a wolf, a question that remains genuinely unresolved. Around the same period, another team uncovered a woolly rhinoceros nicknamed Sasha, the only baby woolly rhino ever found with its skin, hair, and internal tissue still attached. These discoveries have effectively turned parts of Siberia into an open-air museum of the Ice Age, and they have fueled an ambitious and controversial dream among some scientists: the possibility of extracting viable genetic material and one day bringing extinct species back to life. Multiple research teams, including groups working with Russian and South Korean laboratories, have pursued mammoth cloning projects using cellular material recovered from these frozen remains. So far, no attempt has succeeded in producing a living animal. But every new mammoth found intact brings that possibility one step closer, and every announcement reignites the same debate about whether science should be trying to do this at all. If the permafrost can preserve a creature well enough to keep its blood liquid after 42,000 years, the question becomes impossible to avoid. What else might still be down there? And what else might still be capable of moving? Among the Yakut, Ivan, and Evenki peoples native to this region, that question has an answer that has nothing to do with mammoths at all. They call it the Chuchuna, a tall, powerfully built, hair-covered figure said to walk upright through the taiga and mountain ranges of eastern Siberia, particularly around the Verkhoyansk Range and the Indigirka River basin. Described as standing well over 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders, long arms, and a body covered almost entirely in dark or grayish hair, the chuchuna is usually reported wearing simple animal skins rather than going completely bare, a detail that sets it apart from most similar legends elsewhere in the world. Some accounts describe it as intelligent enough to use crude tools and even mimic human speech patterns from a distance, calling out in a way that has led some witnesses to briefly mistake it for a person before realizing nothing human should be standing that far out in such deep snow. Sightings of the chuchuna stretch back long before Russian explorers ever reached the region, appearing in the oral traditions of indigenous Siberian communities for generations. But the reports did not stop with the arrival of modern settlers. Soviet-era expeditions in the 20th century recorded numerous local testimonies describing encounters, including claims from reindeer herders who said the creature had stolen food from their camps during particularly harsh winters, and hunters who described finding oversized human-like footprints pressed into fresh snow in areas with no nearby settlements for miles in any direction. One of the most frequently cited details across multiple independent accounts is the chuchuna's apparent tolerance for extreme cold, said to move comfortably through blizzard conditions that would be lethal to an unprepared human within hours. Some researchers who have studied the legend suggest this detail alone hints at something more than pure invention, since the description consistently matches the specific climate of the region, rather than borrowing generic monster traits from outside folklore. Others argue the chuchuna may be rooted in genuine historical encounters with isolated human groups living deep in the taiga, their appearance and behavior gradually exaggerated into something closer to legend with each retelling across generations. No confirmed remains, hair samples, or photographs have ever conclusively proven the chuchuna's existence, and mainstream science treats it as one of many Bigfoot-type legends found in cold, heavily forested regions around the world, alongside the Almas of Mongolia and the Yeti of the Himalayas. But in a region where the ground itself has proven capable of preserving 40,000-year-old blood in perfect condition, and where genuinely new species of frozen Ice Age animals continue turning up with each passing summer, dismissing every local account outright has become harder to do with total confidence. That question of what might still be moving through Siberia's coldest and most remote terrain eventually leads further south as well, into a landscape that could not look more different from the ice, and yet may be hiding something just as strange. The Gobi Desert stretches across southern Mongolia and northern China, a landscape of endless gravel plains, shifting sand dunes, and extreme temperature swings that can drop from scorching heat during the day to freezing cold at night within a matter of hours. For centuries, Mongolian nomads have told stories about a creature that lives beneath the sand of the Gobi, one that almost nobody claims to have seen up close and survived to describe in full detail. They call it the Olgoi Korkoi, which translates roughly to intestine worm, named for its thick, reddish, blood-filled appearance. Descriptions vary slightly from region to region, but most nomadic accounts agree on the basic shape. A creature between 2 and 5 feet long, shaped almost exactly like a cow's intestine, with no clearly visible head or tail, spending nearly its entire life buried underground, and surfacing only during the hottest weeks of summer, typically in June and July, when the sand itself becomes hot enough to draw it toward the surface. What separates the Olgoi Korkoi from most cryptid legends around the world is just how specific and consistent the danger attributed to it remains across different tellings. Herders describe 2 distinct methods of attack. The first is a spray of highly corrosive venom, said to be capable of dissolving metal on contact, which the creature can supposedly project several feet toward a target without needing to get close. The second, and far stranger, is the claim that the worm can kill instantly through some form of electrical discharge, without ever making physical contact with its victim at all. Reports describe livestock, and occasionally people, dying suddenly near patches of yellow-tinged sand in the open desert, with no visible wounds, no bite marks, and no obvious explanation for the cause of death. Camel herders who travel through the region are said to deliberately avoid certain stretches of desert entirely during the warmest months, choosing to reroute long journeys rather than risk provoking whatever might be buried beneath that particular patch of sand. Western science first took serious notice of the legend in the early 20th century, largely due to the American explorer Roy Chapman Andrews, who led several expeditions into the Gobi during the 1920s while searching primarily for dinosaur fossils and eggs. Andrews documented the Olgoi Khorkhoi in his written accounts of the region, noting that nearly every Mongolian he spoke with firmly believed in the creature's existence, despite the fact that not one of them claimed to have personally witnessed it themselves. He described local officials warning him against traveling into certain parts of the desert during summer, specifically because of the creature, treating the warning with the same seriousness they gave to warnings about sandstorms or lack of water. Since then, several expeditions have set out specifically to find physical evidence of the creature, including an expedition backed partly by British and Czech researchers in the early 1990s, which searched remote regions of the Gobi using specialized equipment, including devices designed to detect unusual electrical activity beneath the sand. No physical specimen has ever been recovered. No confirmed photograph exists anywhere in scientific literature. And yet, the legend has not faded even slightly, appearing consistently across generations of nomadic oral history, in a region where survival has always depended on knowing precisely which threats in the landscape are real and which are not worth the risk of ignoring. Skeptics point out that no known animal on Earth is capable of an electrical attack strong enough to kill from a distance, with the electric eels of South America representing the most powerful bioelectric generators currently documented in nature, and even they require direct physical contact with their prey to deliver a shock. Some researchers propose that the legend may be based on a real but heavily exaggerated animal, possibly a species of large worm lizard, or an unusually thick snake encountered rarely enough over generations that its behavior slowly became mythologized into something far more dangerous than reality. Others suggest the corrosive venom detail may trace back to sightings of the Mongolian pit viper, a genuinely venomous snake native to the region, whose bite can cause severe tissue damage. Whatever the explanation eventually turns out to be, the Olgoi Khorkhoi remains one of the very few cryptid legends never fully explained away, sitting in an unusual scientific limbo somewhere between local mythology and a biological mystery that has simply never been definitively closed. But if the desert holds secrets no one has been able to prove, the frozen ground back in Siberia holds a different kind of danger, one that has already proven itself real, with consequences that reached far beyond folklore. In the summer of 2016, an unusually severe heat wave swept across the Yamal Peninsula in northern Siberia, pushing temperatures higher than they had been in decades. As the upper layers of permafrost thawed more deeply than usual, something buried underground for what scientists estimate was at least 75 years was suddenly released back into the surrounding environment. The result was an outbreak of anthrax, a bacterial disease capable of surviving in dormant spore form for extraordinarily long stretches of time. The outbreak killed more than 2,000 reindeer and hospitalized dozens of people, including one child who later died from the infection. Investigators eventually traced the source back to the frozen carcass of a reindeer that had died from anthrax decades earlier, its remains locked safely inside the permafrost until the extreme heat of that particular summer finally thawed the ground deep enough to expose it once again. This event became one of the clearest, real-world demonstrations of a risk scientists had discussed mostly in theory for years. The permafrost does not just preserve mammoths and cave lions for museums and laboratories. It also preserves whatever pathogens happen to be present when an animal, or a person, died and was frozen into the ground, sometimes for periods far longer than human history itself has existed. In 2014 and 2015, French researchers studying Siberian permafrost samples successfully revived giant viruses that had remained frozen and completely dormant for approximately 30,000 years. Though the specific viruses recovered in these experiments were not harmful to humans, the research proved conclusively that certain ancient pathogens can return to full biological activity after tens of thousands of years locked inside ice, simply by being thawed and given the right conditions to reactivate. Scientists have since raised concerns about the theoretical possibility of far older and potentially far more dangerous pathogens, including extinct or long-eradicated strains of disease, still existing somewhere within the deeper and considerably older layers of permafrost that have not yet been disturbed. As the permafrost continues to thaw at an accelerating rate due to rising global temperatures, researchers warn that events like the 2016 anthrax outbreak may become more frequent in the coming decades, not less, turning a slow-motion climate crisis into a potential biological one as well. And the permafrost is not only releasing what has been buried inside it. In some places, it is disappearing entirely and taking the ground itself down with it. Nowhere is this more visible than at a site locals have nicknamed the Gateway to the Underworld. The Batagayka crater, located in a remote part of the Sakha Republic, is a massive thermokarst depression that began forming in the 1960s after nearby deforestation exposed the permafrost underneath to direct sunlight for the first time in millennia. Once exposed, the frozen ground began to melt and collapse inward, and the crater has continued expanding every single year since, now stretching roughly 1 kilometer long and reaching depths of up to 280 feet. Each summer, the crater grows further, its steep frozen walls collapsing and exposing fresh layers of ancient soil, ice, and preserved organic material that has not been touched by open air in tens of thousands of years. Scientists studying the exposed walls have used the crater almost like a natural core sample, reading backward through layer after layer of frozen history, compressed over roughly 650,000 years. But locals have a very different relationship with the site, largely avoiding the area and treating its steady, visible growth as an unsettling and highly visible symbol of a landscape that is quite literally falling apart from the inside. A similar phenomenon, though far more sudden and violent, has been documented further north on the Yamal and Gidin peninsulas. Since around 2014, a series of massive craters have appeared abruptly across the region, some measuring over 200 feet across and nearly as deep, forming suddenly and violently enough that nearby herders have reported hearing loud explosions moments before discovering the holes. Researchers investigating these craters determined that they form when methane gas, trapped for thousands of years beneath layers of ice-rich permafrost, builds up enough underground pressure to blast directly through the surface in a single, sudden eruption, hurling chunks of frozen earth hundreds of feet away and leaving behind a nearly perfect circular hole. As global temperatures continue to rise and the permafrost across Siberia keeps thawing at unprecedented rates, scientists warn that dozens, and potentially hundreds, of similar methane pockets may currently be building toward eruptions of their own across the region, with no reliable method yet available to predict exactly where or when the next one will occur. Some of these craters have since filled with meltwater and quietly become lakes, gradually reshaping the map of the Siberian tundra. Others remain wide open, steep, walled scars across the landscape, continuously releasing methane directly into the atmosphere and accelerating the very warming responsible for creating them in the first place. The thawing ground is not just a danger to wildlife and climate scientists watching from a distance. It is already reaching into everyday life for the roughly 5 million people who live across Russia's permafrost regions. In the city of Yakutsk, built almost entirely on permafrost and home to over 300,000 residents, engineers have reported buildings tilting and cracking as the frozen ground beneath their foundation softens for the first time since construction. Apartment blocks built decades ago, on the assumption that the ground beneath them would never change, are now being monitored constantly for structural shifts. Roads buckle in places that were perfectly level only a few years earlier. Pipelines shift and rupture as the soil around them moves in ways engineers never had to account for previously. An entire architectural tradition, developed over generations specifically for building safely on permanently frozen ground, is now being tested by ground that, in some places, is no longer permanent at all, forcing entire cities to reconsider how they build for a future none of the original engineers ever planned for. Taken together, the frozen ground of Siberia represents one of the strangest paradoxes on the planet. It is simultaneously one of humanity's most valuable scientific archives, offering perfectly preserved windows into the Ice Age that no laboratory could ever recreate artificially, and one of its most unpredictable modern hazards, capable of releasing forgotten diseases, collapsing entire landscapes without warning, and hiding, according to those who live nearest to similarly frozen and hostile terrain further south, something that science still has not managed to fully explain. The permafrost does not care what it holds onto: a mammoth, a virus, a legend passed down through 100 generations of taiga hunters and desert nomads who never once needed a photograph to know exactly which patch of forest or which stretch of sand to avoid. It keeps all of it frozen in place, indifferent, until the ground finally warms enough to let go. And every single year, it is letting go a little more. What makes Siberia different from almost anywhere else on the planet is that this is not a question of choosing between science and folklore. Both stories are unfolding on the same ground at the same time. The same permafrost that has already handed scientists a 42,000-year-old foal with blood still inside it, a set of perfectly preserved cave lion cubs, in a bacterial outbreak that hospitalized dozens of people in a single summer, is also the exact terrain where generations of Yakut and Ivan hunters insist something large, upright, and covered in hair still moves through the deepest parts of the taiga during the harshest months of winter. Neither claim requires the other to be true, but both come from the same indifferent ground, one that has already proven far more willing to give up its secrets than anyone expected. So the real question may not be whether something like the Chuchuna or the Olgoi Korkoi could actually exist out there in the cold. It may be simpler than that. As Siberia keeps thawing and keeps handing back what it has kept locked away for tens of thousands of years, are we actually ready for everything it eventually decides to give back? What do you think is really buried beneath the ice? Let us know in the comments below, and subscribe if you want to keep uncovering the parts of this planet that science still cannot fully explain.